Hey, I would ask you to bear with me with this video because there's a few things I want to cover. As I am making this video, I'm watching clothing screen stripping the way this is being filmed, but it's basically the repatriation ceremony of victims from the Tunisia terror attacks to the United Kingdom. It's been revealed that the majority of victims in the Tunisia attacks were British nationals, which makes it our worst terrorist attack since 7/7, 10 years ago, and the worst attack on Westerners in that time. Um, Needless to point out, there have been rivers, oceans of blood spilt around the world in that time through terrorism and particularly recent in the last 2 years by Islamic State. There's a lot of things I want to cover in this. Like I say, please do bear with me. Um, Whenever there's a big terrorist attack like we saw in Tunisia, there's usually we see the best of humanity and also the worst of humanity. That sounds like a cliche, but it really is true. I heard, for example, about a young man who, despite losing three members of his own family, he's only 16 years old, he went to help other victims. I mean, that sort of selflessness is inspiring and incredible. There was a man who threw himself in front of his girlfriend. I believe he's recovering in hospital, shot 3 times. It was a Tunisian builder who risked his own life by throwing tiles at the gunman. And that was taking a risk because, bear in mind, the builder wasn't armed. The gunman could easily have just shot up. So, we saw some inspiring acts in Tunisia, but we also saw it for what it was, a brutal massacre. Um, and on the same day, of course, there was the attack on the mosque in Kuwait, and the man was decapitated in the south of France. It's believed that all three attacks were at the hands of Islamic State. Now, as excuse me, an analyst pointed out, um, Islamic State will be keen to take credit for any atrocity that happens, because they obviously want to make themselves as feared as possible. Um, Whether these were lone wolf attacks or coordinated is still being determined. But it's known that a few days ago, a spokesman for Islamic State, or Daesh, and I'll come to the name issue in a minute because that is getting increasingly significant, um, called on attacks to multiply during Ramadan. So in that one day we saw an international um, series of attacks, 3 different countries, thousands of miles apart, um, and it shows that if not Islamic State, then terrorism generally is a very real threat. There are people who like to downplay terrorism and say that there isn't a threat. It's all a conspiracy theory made up by governments. That's just, I mean, wake up. Um, One thing that isn't being reported as much is that, and it could be because the situation is so god awful, but in the fall of Kobani, the Syrian town of Kobani, ISIS was accused of committing its worst atrocity yet, possibly as many as 140 civilians killed after Kobani fell to Daesh. That's a truly staggering massacre. To put that in context, it's more than all the victims in the other 3 attacks combined. But of course, it's getting less coverage. It could be because Syria has seen so many deaths that it's no longer news, which is a tragedy. Because every single one of the people killed in Kobani were men, women, and children who had interests, who had personalities, they had people who loved them. Um, and it's not that I have no problem with this being reported. I mean, I'm a British citizen, of course. My heart goes out to my compatriots. But we do need to keep in context that the vast majority of victims of terrorism live in the Middle East, and in many cases, they're sort of showing it to victims. It is sad to watch when you hear the personal stories. A lot of them were older people, actually. There's a young woman there, she's only 24. Um, I think the intention, I'm just going to break down the three attacks first of all, and what I suspect the intention was of those particular targets, based on what I've seen in reports and so on. In Tunisia, it was clearly the damage to the tourism industry there. Tunisia has been one of the most stable countries post-Arab Spring. It's one of the most moderate countries. Um, so quite clearly, Islamic State wants to infiltrate that and destabilize it, just like they're doing with Iraq. Um, I also think that it is quite clear that they're trying to inspire jihadists from Tunisia to join their organization. The the gunman responsible was said to be local. He was only 23, and like a lot of jihadists, he sounds like an absolutely gullible moron. Um, Tunisia, although it has been one of the more moderate countries to come out of Arab Spring, there has been a very large number of Tunisians have been volunteering for Islamic State. In fact, I believe more than any other country. Um, Something like 3,000 Tunisians, I've seen that quoted, have volunteered with Islamic State. That does raise very serious questions about the problem that exists there in terms of radicalization. Not that it is unique to Tunisia. I mean, goodness knows we've got a very big problem with homegrown terrorists here. I have a Syrian friend, and he can't get around. He can't understand how young British Muslims can be so brainwashed that they would feel the need to join this murderous death cult. Anyway, the attack in Kuwait in the mosque there was clearly designed. Again, Kuwait is a relatively stable country. Saudi Arabia has had a number of attacks this year, but as far as I know, this is the first large-scale attack on Kuwait in many years. 45 people killed on a Shia mosque. Quite clearly, that was designed to cement sectarian warfare. Hopefully, the people of Kuwait will not let that happen, and it will not break into a Shia-Sunni schism. That would be devastating, obviously. Um, I think Islamic State is determined. Daesh is absolutely determined to fuel this sectarian war that is already going on in the Middle East between Shia and Sunni. But the truth is, the vast majority of Shia and Sunni people, I don't think, hate the other side, but these death cults, Daesh is the most famous, but there's others as well that are trying to cement this. And frankly, I think some governments in the region are not helping matters. I mean, when Saudi Arabia is pounding the hell out of Yemen, killing many civilians in the process, that is not going to help matters. And it could be called an act of state terrorism. Um, Incidentally, it is curious that there's far more muted criticism of that than there was of Israel last year with its bombardment of Gaza. And I'm not going to get into sort of rights and wrongs of that, because otherwise this video will take all day. But I just think there is an inconsistency. You know, what's the difference between 2,000 Gazans and 3,000 Yemenis? I don't see any moral difference. And in the case of France, well, that may have been a work dispute, because apparently the victim was the boss of the man who was arrested. But the thing with that is Islamic flags are planted nearby, so you know, the black flag that Daesh uses, which would suggest there is a connection. You know, it doesn't sound like a going postal situation, which refers to disgruntled workers sort of taking out revenge on their bosses. This sounds like it was an ideologically inspired attack as well. So quite clearly, this is a universal problem. Now, I'm aware that there is a lot of speculation, a lot of theories, and a lot of arguments as to how Daesh is funded. and a lot of people are saying, well, the West created this problem in the first place. I'm not going to say very much about that because I simply do not know. Um, I'm not going to be so naive as to say, oh, that's stupid, we're innocent. We may well have a role to have played in the growth of Islamic State. Um, but I always think when there is a problem, it's a bit pointless kind of looking at the background so much. We know there is a problem, and the most important thing right now is tackling the problem. Um, in terms of how we respond to this, there's no easy answers. I'm tired of saying that, but it's the truth. There are no easy answers. David Cameron's speculating on the RAF attacks in parts of Syria. Whether that would be with or without the approval of the Syrian government, I don't know. Of course, it would be controversial. It always is. But this is a war that we don't really have a choice about. We're in this, whether we like it or not. We could take the approach of, oh, well, for years we've been meddling in the Middle East. Let's just get out and leave them to it. It's terrible what's happening there, but let's just ignore everything. You see, the problem with that attitude is if we do that, I really don't believe that Daesh will simply be content with the areas they have. Their stated aim is to create a universal caliphate. That is their stated aim. And they will target anybody who gets in their way. We're not talking here about, the Palestinians where it's a territorial issue. We are talking about an organization, a murderous death cult, absolutely hell-bent on creating a universal caliphate, or at least a caliphate spreading from Morocco to Pakistan. This and to think that that can happen and we can just stay out of it is profoundly naive. And other major powers, such as Russia and China, can't afford to ignore this either. Um, I mean, in the case of China, people may think, oh, well, what's China got to do with it? They haven't had any military campaigns in the Middle East in recent years. True, but in the case of China, you have a separatist movement in Xinjiang. I'm not saying that's connected to Islamic State, but you could have a situation whereby if there continues to be tensions in that region, Islamic State will take advantage of it and move in. So this really is a universal problem. Um, at the moment, the good news is there's been very few Chinese Muslims have become radicalized. A very small percentage. But I believe if the tensions continue in Xinjiang and if the Chinese government takes the wrong approach, then you could see that area becoming increasingly Islamized. And we've seen it in Russia as well. Certainly, Islamization was a factor in the Chechen conflicts. Um, the truth is, wherever there is a situation where there is a perception the Muslims are being persecuted, Islamic State will use that to their advantage. But that's perverse because Islamic State doesn't give a damn about other Muslims. In fact, they consider, for example, Shia to be apostates. They consider the Ahmadis and Sufis to be apostates. What we are looking at here is a medieval mentality. We're looking at the sort of schism between Catholics and Protestants that gripped Europe in the 16th century, and potentially even deadlier. So we really can't afford to ignore this. And I think when people say things like, oh, well, Western governments have brought this on themselves, um, even if that's your position, you cannot say, oh, well, because of that, then we should just mind our own business and stay out of it. Sure, it could be argued because we have helped to cause a problem, if that is the case, then we have a responsibility to sort out the mess that we helped create. Would that not make sense? Um, Broadly speaking, based on what I know, I would say that a bombing campaign is necessary at this stage. Will it stop Islamic State completely? No, it won't. But at the very least, it will slow them down. However, first and foremost, it needs to be Arab states that sort this mess out more than anybody else. Partly because they're going to be in the very front line of this, well, they already are. it's Syrians and Iraqis who are by far suffering the most from this cancer. Um, I believe there should be massive pressure put on the likes of Saudi Arabia to really rein in on the Islamism that exists there. Now, after 9/11, they did launch a very hardline counter-terrorism campaign, but what no one really spoke about was the fact that this Salafist ideology began in Saudi Arabia in the first place. And the truth is, the Saudi royal family is utterly corrupt. Um, so they have definitely played a role, I believe, in fostering this ideology. No question about it. So definitely we also need to reassess our relationship with Saudi Arabia because, well, one thing I will say is I don't believe in victimhood for terrorists. I believe that people who deliberately target men, women, and children deserve no sympathy whatsoever. And I get quite angry when I hear people try to make excuses for them and try to present them as victims, even if they have personally suffered. For them to take that out on other civilians, you can't even attempt to make a moral argument with that. I mean, if they oppose British foreign policy, the people in Tunisia were just tourists enjoying their holiday. They have nothing to do with foreign policy. Now they say, oh, in democracy you vote in your leaders, but they don't know the individual mindset of those people. Some of them may well not have voted for this government. So any sort of attempt, I think, to create a moral argument for the likes of Daesh with the sadistic thuggery that they're constantly taking part in. And that's not over we're looking at victims of terrorist attacks here. That doesn't even include the countless atrocities that they're committing. There was disgusting footage recently of four men in orange suits in a cage. The identity of the men wasn't revealed. I don't know if they were Syrian soldiers or who they were, but they were basically lowered into water in a cage and slowly drowned. Some of the other victims were decapitated and others were put in a car and the car was blown up. The depravity of this organization seems to be absolutely limitless. I mean, they are making Al Qaeda look like a picnic. Um, Now, in regards to the name, this is becoming a very contentious issue. Yesterday, David Cameron said that we shouldn't be calling them Islamic State because they've got no legitimacy with Islam. Um, I understand that the point here is to isolate them, and that's a good thing. They do need to be isolated. And I understand that the vast majority of Muslims utterly abhor them. Well, I'm saying vast majority, actually. There have been some polls conducted that show in some areas a worrying number of people actually support them. And we cannot overlook the fact that there has been a large number of jihadists going to Syria. Now, still a very small minority of the Muslim community in this country, but too many, clearly too many. So I think we really need to. It's no good just saying, "Oh, this is terrorism," and that's it. This is ideological terrorism. How can anyone try to refute that? This is ideological terrorism. Saying it's got nothing to do with Islam to me is a bit like saying the Crusaders had nothing to do with Christianity. I get that the majority of Muslims have nothing to do with this. I get that these people may well be misinterpreting the Quran, and in many cases they may be taking surahs literally as opposed to metaphorically, which is what most Muslims would do. Um, so there is a big problem here in terms of ideology, and to say that they're not Muslims it's rubbish. It's a bit to me that's like saying, well, no Muslim is capable of extremism. I understand that if you're a devout Muslim and you're a decent person and you love your family and you do things for charity and all the rest of it, and you have nothing to do with these thugs, I get that you would want to say that they had nothing to do with your religion. I understand that. But you cannot change the fact that they are, in their mind, acting in the name of Islam. It's irrefutable. They're not saying we're doing this in the name of Buddhism or Christianity or Judaism or Hinduism. They're acting in the name of Islam. They may well be perverting Islam. They may well be absolutely, they may never go to mosques. They may never read the Quran, etc. But the fact of the matter is they're using Islam, and no one can dispute this. So when David Cameron comes out and refuses to recognize the ideology and just talks about it as terrorism, that to me shows that he's afraid. He's afraid of the sensitivities around his very important subject. If I was Prime Minister, of course I would be diplomatic in the sense that I would be very careful not to scapegoat all Muslims. However, I would have no bones about using the word Islamism because that's what this ideology is. I would say we have an Islamist ideology here, we have to tackle it. And the majority of British Muslims are decent, law-abiding people. But this is a problem that the Muslim community needs to recognize. And constantly talking about Islamophobia and trying to hide from the fact that this is a reality isn't going to solve the problem. It's just not. There are some people, like the British Muslims for Secular Democracy, which is an organisation I've quoted before because I have a lot of respect for them, that recognise this as a reality. They recognise Islamism as a real phenomenon. They don't try to make excuses. They don't try to say, oh, but they're nothing to do with Islam. They're just terrorists. The thing about terrorism is these people do not wake up in the morning and decide they're going to massacre 30 people. It's a gradual process of radicalization. And that comes from somewhere. It comes from hate preachers, it comes from online indoctrination, it comes from a wide range of issues. But to say that there is no ideology there is just plain naive. There is. And until we start to recognize this, and until we stop being so cowardly and so politically correct about how we talk about this subject, I don't think it's going to be solved. This needs to be something that's tackled within. And I mean, take for example, when we had jihadists going to the Middle East, the same explanation every time from their friends and family is, oh, they were a good Muslim, they never showed any signs of extremism. Now, maybe those people genuinely didn't see the extremism, but that indicates to me that not enough is being done within the Muslim community to recognize this threat and to tackle it. We need to absolutely close mosques where hate preaching has been taking place. No question about it. We need to take a hard line on that. Not close all mosques, but take a hard line against mosques where clearly hate preachers have been operating. No ifs, buts, or maybes. We are in an ideological war with this. And I don't agree with those who say that we should just view Daesh as criminals. This is a war. I don't know how anyone can say that it isn't. It's not a conventional war where you have two armies fighting each other, but this is a murderous death cult that is killing people on a daily basis, torturing people on a daily basis, enslaving women, brutalizing gay people. I mean, how far does their depravity have to go before we just call this what it is? Um, so I do have strong views about this, but unfortunately we're still in a situation in this country where if anyone says this, they're immediately branded a member of the EDL or Britain First, or they're a horrible Islamophobe. I'm fed up with it. I'm really fed up with it. Incidentally, carrying out attacks during Ramadan is, again, it just shows their depravity. It shows that they are determined to foster a sectarian war within Islam. The fact that they've carried out attacks during Ramadan, people say, well, that proves they're not Muslims. Well, Christian extremists in the 17th century and the 16th century carried out, witch burnings and so on. Oh, that's not a good example. They burned heretics during Easter. So what's the difference? What is the difference? That doesn't prove anything, the fact they've carried out attacks during Ramadan. I mean, it's terrible, it's perverse, but it doesn't prove that they're not Muslims. To me, it just shows that they're fanatics who look down on other Muslims. But saying that they're not Muslims is like, it's trying to detach the problem from its source, which is Salafism in Saudi Arabia the birthplace of Islam. So I'm going to round up in a minute because I have been speaking for a while, but we're going to see a lot of this. This is going to be a very long struggle, and it's a lot more complicated than the Cold War, where you had different political ideologies, i.e., communism versus democracy. This is more complicated because with communism and democracy, there wasn't the same sort of death cult. There was there was a door for compromise. With this, I don't know how you compromise with Islamism. I can't see any way that you can, because if you compromise, that's basically like enslaving people to their ideology. Kind of meeting them halfway, I don't think it will work, because these people are fanatics who do not want to meet halfway. So unfortunately, we're going to be in a very long struggle, and I think pacifists need to wake up. This is not something I want. I'm not a hawk. I hate war, but this is just a reality. And the likes of the Stop the War coalition, I have very little respect for them, because all they seem to do is denounce Western governments whilst completely ignoring the nightmare situation, the atrocities these organizations are constantly taking part in. Oh, once again, about the name, I was going to talk a little bit about that. Islamic State, Daesh, ISIS, ISIL. Um, I do agree that probably Daesh is the best word. Why? Because they hate it. And I do agree that we should polarize them. They are trying to get a caliphate. So in that sense, their title is accurate. But I do see where the argument is coming from. So perhaps Daesh, which I understand is an Arabic word, is the best term to use. I'm going to try that and do that from now on in my videos. I mean, among other things, Isis was an ancient Egyptian goddess. Um, so yeah, and also calling them Islamic State gives them a legitimacy that they actually have an entire state. It's not a country, and we need to remember that. So I'll leave it there. But basically, I think people need to wake up. We are in a war, and I think simply ignoring this problem is not going to it's not going to go away. Now, the position of the likes of the Stop the War coalition is basically, oh, our military campaigns are exacerbating the problem. Whether or not that is the case, their position is also basically bordering on apologizing for these groups. I'm yet to see the Stop the War coalition recognize Islamism for what it is, and I'm sick and tired of them entirely demonizing the British government whilst refusing to recognize that this is a problem with Islamic fundamentalism. The very fact that they say, oh, we condemn the attack, but, and there's always a but, then they go on to make this critique of Western foreign policy. There comes a point when you just have to condemn what's happening and not try to make these people out to be victims. Daesh are not victims, they're thugs. They're a murderous death cult and they need to be stopped. Thanks for watching.